So here at Cobra Cults, we use our satanic powers for good. Thank you very much.
Radio Free Innsmouth episode 316. About 3.5 years ago, I put out what I believe was the longest episode of this program, episode 135. If anybody out there can correct me on that. Congratulations! You officially know more about this program than I, the creator, do. Anyways, that episode was about the classic Russian metal band Aria, one of the most important bands from the Soviet era. And despite the fact that it was quite long, it only covered like the first third of their discography, that being their 80s albums. I'd call that kind of the first era of Aria, if you were really gonna get pedantic about it.
Do you also conduct photosynthesis, or do you...
Nerd! The 80s actually contains the first two eras of Aria, in that it's got the albums with Alnik Granovsky and Andrei Bolshakov on them. They both left after the Skiemte album came out in 1986 to start the classic Russian thrash metal band Master, not to be confused with the classic early Chicago death metal band Master.
Don't be driving goofy, you're back!
They're both fantastic bands, but they're very different. The one from Chicago sounds like Underneath for Master, in the wood of your mind. Whereas the Russian one sounds more like two very different sounds, both great bands.
Everybody got that?
I should probably do an episode on the Russian band Master someday, since they're pretty great. But this one's about Aria. It's about what I personally consider to be the second era of Aria, kind of the 90s and early 2000s-ish. If you're not familiar with Aria at all, you probably should watch that first Aria episode I did way back when, because I got into them with their 80s stuff, and they've been one of my favorite bands of all time for like the past 15 years or some shit. So obviously they're doing something right on those 80s albums. I haven't been listening to their later stuff for quite as long as I've been into their 80s shit, probably going on like 5 years or so now, and it seems to not be as talked about in the Western world as much as well. Cutting off the first era with the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of the 90s is somewhat arbitrary, I will admit, especially since the first Aria album that came out in the 90s is very much still part of what I would consider that first era of Aria. So if you don't feel like going back and listening to some old crappy RFI episode, this little brief overview of 1991's Blood for Blood will give you a basic idea of what Aria sounds like. That said, I still see it as something of a transitional album, given that it's a lot darker and thrashier and harsher sounding than the bulk of their 80s stuff. Right from the start of the album, you can see why people refer to these guys as the Russian Iron Maiden, though I actually like these guys a little more than Maiden.
What?
Don't worry, I got nothing against Maiden.
Okay!
I just kind of vibe with these guys a little bit more, and a lot of that has to do with Valery Kipilov's vocals, which on this particular album are a lot rougher and grittier sounding than what I usually expect from him. That kind of nastier sound definitely fits the lyrical concepts of this particular song, Gracia Norfolk, about a lost battalion from the Gallipoli campaign. But that grittier sound also makes it all the more startling when he does shift into a more major key like he's doing here. One of my favorite vocal moments in all of Aria, this little turnaround bit. Quality stuff, but it shifts tone again, leading into this little thrashy bit. Definitely a lot heavier and more hostile sounding than their prior material, while still definitely being recognizably Aria-ish. However, I gotta think maybe that harsher tone they were taking was presaging some of the developments that were to come with the band, in that after this album came out, they weren't getting along with each other as well. And at one point, Valery Kipelov was actually going to leave the band, so it would have been like the second big splintering of Aria after the guys left to form Master. If Valery had left, the only original member of Aria at this point would have been Vladimir Kolstinin, the guitarist, which, you know, they probably could have survived, but it would have been a big shakeup. Luckily for Aria's commercial prospects at the time, eventually they did work it out with Kipelov, and he ended up returning 4 years later for the somewhat belated follow-up album, Night is Shorter Than Day, which prominently features Buba on the cover. Like its predecessor, this album actually is quite a bit darker than older Aria material, but whereas that one leaned more into thrash and aggression, this one's almost like a more gloomy take on the stompier kind of heavy metal they were doing on their second album. Like the title track starts out with this riff, definitely would have sounded out of place on an Accept album, but once the vocal melodies and guitar melodies start creeping in, it takes on this more gothic, depressive character that I find to be interesting. It has a lot of tonal overlap with the third album from Seikimatsu. Wouldn't you know it? Those guys are one of my favorite bands, and so's Aria. But watch what happens when the chorus kicks in. By far the closest to doom metal these guys had ever sounded, even more so than the song The Volunteer off of their debut album, which admittedly did get pretty down-tempo. And then after the chorus, it goes into this total dark power metal fantasy-inspired section with very expansive guitar harmonies on top of that maddening keyboard drone. Another good comparison might be a much darker take on Ozzy Osbourne's 80s solo material, like Shot in the Dark. But then they go total Russian Iron Maiden with this part that sounds like their take on Hallowed Be Thy Name. Or at least it does until they speed that same riff back up and add another keyboard layer to it. Then it becomes just Aria, like nobody else really can pull this style off as well as them, if you ask me. Night is Shorter Than Day, solid album, and the one after it seems to be viewed as kind of the best of Aria's 90s work, not counting that Blood for Blood album I played at the beginning of the episode, which really belongs spiritually more to their 80s material. Generator of Evil. This one's a pretty weird and interesting sort of album. It's kind of the beginning of a really modern sound for Aria, abandoning a lot of that Russian Iron Maiden sound they'd become so famous for, in favor of a lot more experimentation. Like this heavy, palm-muted, yet still harmonized riff right here has a lot more in common with Crimson Glory, who I covered about 4 years ago on episode 107, than it does with Iron Maiden. This is the start of like the weird prog era of Aria. I mean, check out the super strange verse riff right here. Almost doing kind of like a weird reggae, accenting the offbeat sort of thing, but with a distorted guitar. Definitely not something usual for power metal. And it creates a lot of negative space in the music for Kipelov to insert his vocals into, which is very different than what Aria had been doing up until this point in their careers. I mean, they do bring in the flowing melodicism after a bit, but even that has a very odd sound to it with this weird droning sort of melodic guitar riff interlocking with a more percussive one, and Kipelov's vocals sort of vacillating between being very major key, but also rather forlorn sounding and ending on a lot of more dissonant intervals, generating a real sense of tension, generating some evil. Which, of course, is the aim of the album. But like I said, this is also the start of them getting really weird and proggy, like with this little bass interlude right here leading into an extended instrumental freakout, utilizing a lot more wah pedal and weird guitar noises than they had in their career to this point, building up into an absolute riff monster going on underneath some very bendy and evil sounding soloing. Like, it's still recognizably Aria, but it's got way more Sabbath doom and gloom and strangeness to it than one might expect for a nominally power metal sort of band. Jumping back into that weird instrumental freakout section again. Really good, solid fucking album. Generator of Evil seems to get a decent amount of praise from the Aria faithful nowadays. Same cannot be said for the album that came out a few years later, Chimera. Based on the very limited amount of discourse in English about the band Aria, Chimera seems to be particularly poorly received by a lot of modern day Aria fans. And I wasn't expecting much, a late career album from a band that had been around for so long. The last album with their original vocalist before he left for good doesn't sound too promising. Then I actually gave the album a proper listen a few years back, and
I'm like, WTF? It's like, what the fuck? It's like, what?
At least in my ears, this sounds like a really good Aria album and a very logical follow-up to the weirder direction they were heading in with Generator of Evil. I'm thinking if you're going into this album expecting, it's the Russian Iron Maiden again, you're probably gonna hate it. But if that's your mindset, I wouldn't be surprised if you have a lot of problems walking and breathing at the same time.
앞머리 안 자를 거예요.
Okay, maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration. But I gotta think, if you know Generator of Evil inside and out, and you know its place in Aria's overall discography, I gotta expect you would be able to see an album like Chimera coming out a mile away. I mean, this one leads even harder into the doom and gloom than that album did, if that's even possible. It's even further removed from the high-flying power metal of kind of their classic era. But when you take it for what it is, in and of itself, I think it's fucking great. They bring in even stranger guitar textures, the this time around, supplementing that already revolutionary wah pedal work from the last album with a pretty prominent focus on incorporation of talkbox. It's an album that's heavy on texture, and to decry it as a typical 90s sellout album would be missing the point entirely. I mean, this kind of weird gothic doom metal wasn't really any more popular amongst the mainstream Nirvana listening masses than the 80s metal of their early material. I also really like how the guitar sound on this album switches between really crunchy and really smooth very quickly. But right now, we are building up to a massive fucking chorus. Even if you're an 80s Aria purist, I can't see you hating this, because this has to be one of Kipelov's greatest choruses. I mean, the way his vocals tie in with those guitars perfectly, and how spacey that riffing gets.
Rock and roll, motherfucker!
That's properly done 90s heavy metal from a time when, for a lot of people, they thought that style was dying out. Aria managed to evolve while staying true to themselves. But for whatever reason, maybe latent band disagreement stemming back to the fracas of the early 90s, maybe a lukewarm reception of this, their newest album, Kipelov did finally leave Aria after Chimera came out. He went on to start his own solo project, also entitled Kipelov, that are also very much worth listening to if you were an Aria fan. And he actually took Aria's longtime drummer, Alexander Manyakin, with him. So you'd think, okay, maybe this is the end for Aria, but you've still got the band founder, guitarist Vladimir Kolstinin around. You've still got Vitaly on bass, and you've got Sergei, who's also been playing guitar for them for the 2 albums prior to this one. So unsurprisingly, Aria decided to continue. They found a new vocalist, Artur Berkut, who seems to be a little bit controversial nowadays amongst the Arians, which is the name of the Aria fan base, by the way. And it's spelled exactly like you think it would be.
Zeke!
But personally, I think the 2 Berkut albums with Aria are pretty spectacular. They actually did end up getting re-recorded with the vocalist they got after Berkut due to some kind of rights dispute, I think. But the original versions are well worth tracking down if you want to hear quality Aria in an interesting new way that you might not have heard them before. This stuff follows off of Chimera and Generator of Evil, but it manages to combine that style with the older, more power metal sounding atmosphere of their earlier material in an interesting way. Their songwriting also takes a turn towards the epic, featuring longer running times as well as an even more expansive array of sonic textures, like this weird little folky bit combined with that very Iron Maiden-ish sounding bass line. Then the vocals kick in, and I can see why some Arians might have been startled or worried upon picking up Baptism by Fire, because during the music's softer moments, Berkut sounds very different from what you'd come to expect from a vocalist like Kipelov. He almost has more in common with like a chanson vocalist, but give it some time and I'm sure you'll learn to appreciate him, especially once the music picks up in tempo, like it's about to right here.
Where? There. When? Now.
During their heavier moments, he definitely proves that he's capable of reproducing the same sort of vocals that you would expect out of a guy like Kipelov. Fits right in with the rest of the Aria sound. And as you're hearing right now, this album's considerably more upbeat than Doom and Gloom of Chimera or Generator of Evil, especially when those very power metal choruses hit. That's what I mean when I took a turn for the epic. Stuff that I'm hearing right now is combining sort of like the soccer hooliganism you might expect from early Iron Maiden with an almost Hammerheart era Bathory sounding kind of Viking metal atmosphere.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
You're right, I did promise they were going to be bringing back a lot of that 80s power metal feeling as well. And they do that on some of the other songs on this album. But that sort of atmosphere is also heavily supplemented with the newfound kind of Bathory or Manowar-esque feel going on. It's got those same harmonies from their classic material, but the guitars are still a lot more leaning towards a percussive sound. The whole thing definitely has this sort of very spiritual, almost pagan atmosphere to it, very much befitting of the artwork. Here's some more Bathory style shit, but they combine that with the weirder sonic textures of their more prog metal period in an interesting sort of way. Kind of a marriage of this odd psychedelic doom metal with epic Bathory style Viking metal. Really interesting, really unique stuff. off.
아, 이거는 못 고르지.
Now, don't worry, the neoclassical power metal shit is also coming. In fact, they're going back even farther to the roots of that style, including a lot of these like more thin Lizzy sounding sections. Probably the heaviest usage of guitar harmonies they'd had since the early 90s. And they tie in quite nicely with the very stadium-ready soloing that permeates this album. And even during these sections, you still got that sort of like jangly, marching kind of battery thing going on in the background. Baptizing with Fire, really fucking cool Aria album, highly underrated by people nowadays. But the album that came out after that, entitled Armageddon, is, if you ask me, Berkut's crowning achievement with the band. Because this one does an even better job of combining their weird 90s psychedelic thing with the power metal kind of stuff they had going on in the 80s. Like, boom, first song on the album. Got some high-flying power metal guitar harmonies going on, but with that little bit of 90s darkness lurking in the background. Then when they go into the verses, they start bringing in all those weird guitar effects they've been experimenting with around the time period, marrying that to the power metal-y bits that have resurfaced from their 80s material. It's an interesting sort of layering of multiple eras of Aria's sound going on, all in the middle of the same song. He's a particularly well done Berkut vocal. He's not quite Kipelov, but he doesn't have to be. He's doing his own thing. Like the band, they're doing their own thing. It's not 80s Aria. It's something new, but it harkens back to that. I really like how when they bring the verse back around the second time, they've completely varied up the guitar style going on underneath it, getting a lot more percussive. Then almost sort of a weird psychedelic thing going on for the pre-chorus. A whole bunch of flanger on that guitar. And when that chorus comes back in, it ties everything together quite nicely. Looping back around to that awesome harmonized lead that started out the song, only now Berkut's voice is doing the melodic part, leaving the guitars more time to concentrate on these weird, almost dissonant bar chord riffs, kind of dueling in the background. And from there, it jumps into that more melodic thrash style, making a reappearance from the Blood for Blood album way back in 1991. So that opening track, fucking sick, but my favorite track on this album, Guardian of the Empire, is also probably within like my top 5 Aria songs overall. This one goes even harder on the fucking harmonies. I mean, obviously, that intro riff fucks. That shit goes hard as hell, and then when they get to the verses this time around, it's even stranger. Doing that thing again where Berkut is the main melodic component of the music, and then the guitars are doing this weird abrasive sounding shit. But from there, it goes totally retro. Definitely harkening back to their 80s material with this section of the song. Those mournful speed metal riffs married to that emotionally intense chorus perfectly. Like, if you were an 80s Aria diehard, you'd probably been waiting for the band to do this kind of shit for the better part of a decade at this point, and they definitely deliver with the goods. To the point where, depending on how you like your Aria, this could be seen as something of a comeback album. But it's also got notes of their prior album. Like this whole section right here, harkening back to that Manowar or Hammerheart era battery sound they were experimenting with. Way more percussive, way more epic style of riffing. From there leading into the solos, and the solos on this album was some of the best they ever did. I mean, for me, this is one of the best Aria albums. Very different sound than some might expect, although it does harken back a lot to their 80s material. Unfortunately, it was also their last album with Berkut. Yet another vocalist band personality conflict split everything up. From there, they hired Mikhail Zhitnikov and have done 3 more albums with him. Maybe I'll cover those someday if there's any interest, because they're also pretty good. With that 90s and 2000s run of Aria, specifically what I would call like their weirder period from 95 through 2006, that's some highly underrated material. And I think if you want to hear the strange sort of things you can do with the power metal genre, a style of music that's often noted for its slavish adherence to a certain template, you really got to check out those Aria albums. I mean, just check out Aria in general. They're like one of my favorite bands, one of the best fucking bands ever. Hopefully you agree, but even if you didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever the fuck you did, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Well, kiss my ass. Anyway, bye-bye.